How all this came to be was I was going to be teaching Sunday school class one Sunday to a large adult Sunday school class, the seniors. You always have your senior me and your senior. This was the big class, and I taught that class every so often. And the text of the day was the story out of Daniel about the three Hebrew guys who get in trouble because they won't bow down, and they're going to get thrown in the fiery furnace. But the topic of the day, the lesson title, was right worship. I didn't exactly see how those two paired together. So I just kind of moved the right worship over to the side and then said, well, I'll just talk about the three Hebrew children. That is until this little lady right next to me, Mary Baker, leaned over with her Sunday school book and said, I can't wait till you get to this part. And this part was right worship. Well, I felt obligated. And so I was going to just make a statement about how we understand how worship is created and what is the concept of right worship. The week before, the youth had conducted worship service in the traditional worship service. And with this bunch of old folks, I opened up an absolute firestorm of what was right worship. You can't do right worship when you're wearing tennis shoes and a cut-off T-shirt or something. You can't do right worship when you're singing these songs and nobody else knows how to sing. And this went on for a solid hour. I never got to the Hebrew boys, and that bothered me some. Um, and then not long after that, I was doing a spiritual retreat down in South Alabama for a group of folks. And in this spiritual retreat, part of the process was to explore their calling. What does God really want me to do? And one session was just that. Let's talk about what God is expecting you to do. Well, it started out like that, but in just a few minutes, the discussion went to the way people were worshiping. And I got in this same conversation again with these people, uh, talking about how this is the right way to worship. You cannot do this, you cannot do that. And it just goes over and over again. And I kept thinking to myself, what in response to all these reactions can I do? And so I wondered why. And now this was in 2010. At this point in church history, you had a number of churches that had their traditional worship services, and then they were beginning to develop their contemporary worship services. And what we discovered is that the two worship services were suspect at each other. Some churches became two churches. The contemporary group didn't really interact with the traditional, and the traditional felt like those people needed to leave and go find another place anyway. And so you had all these tensions building up within the church where we basically had a battle line drawn over the topic of what is the right way to do it. So I had explored that, and I finally told Karen, I said, we need to know where this stuff starts and how we got to where we are in the pattern and history of worship. And so that's how it is. Who decides on what is right worship? God didn't give us a lot of good details in the Bible about things. God did not give us a format for Sunday morning, 11 o'clock worship. God did not tell us when we baptize people how deep the water is supposed to be, the temperature of the water, if we hold them under so long, or do we just sprinkle them a little bit. There's so many of those types of things that we are not privy to. And so we make it up on our own. And so it become a true journey. And so we begin working with that. And you have to begin the journey at the very beginning. And that very beginning part uh, is from the creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Uh, and we think that from that very beginning, God had given us these preconceived notions of what worship is all about. It really starts on the seventh day. When on the seventh day, when God finished the work that he had been doing, he ceased, that is, he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy because on it God ceased from all the work. Now, notice when you read that text in Genesis, it did not say that the seventh day was made for worship. It was made for rest. And for generations upon generations, the Sabbath day was not a day you went to church. The Sabbath day was the day you stayed at home and you recreated, you thought, you revived yourself. You went to temple or tabernacle or synagogue on the other days of the week. So we don't start off with a Sabbath set aside to worship. We have a Sabbath set aside to actually recreate it. It stayed that way until the Babylonian exile. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. That's at 586 BC. The first commandment God gave to Adam was not bow down and worship me. In fact, the first uh, commandment in the Bible is take care of the garden. That was Adam's task. And we never see where Adam and Eve come into the presence of God and bow down. The Genesis story says that Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the evening in the garden. It was a relationship. It was community, camaraderie between humanity and God as they moved around in the breezy time of the day. God had fellowship. And so that was the term of it. That's where we're supposed to be, walking with God, interacting with God. And at this point in time, there's not a humbling down. The major shift came after the boys got around. Of course, we won't go through all the who ate the apple stuff. I saw a bumper sticker years ago in a parking lot about creation. It said Eve was framed. And really, I laughed at it because I said, yes, she was. Come on in. Because one, why would you want people to not touch and eat a tree and then plant it right in the middle of where they are? And the second thing is, when she finally took the fruit, whatever it was, an apple, a banana, whatever, if you'll notice, it says, and Adam was there the whole time. And yet he never opened his mouth. He didn't say, now listen, Eve, you need to take stock. This serpent's trying to trick you. You need to be back down a little bit. It never went that way. But anyway, you had the fall, you had the sliding out, you had the casting out, and then next thing you know, you got two boys, Cain and Abel. One uh, is a shepherd, a herder, one who tends animals. The other is one who works in the field. This is the very beginning of the fights that we used to see on all old Western TV, where the cattle farmers and the corn farmers would always fight, because they didn't like each other. There never seemed to be a row about it. You just had two boys that had different vocational paths. And somewhere, and we are not told, this notion of bringing a gift to God as an offering appears. It's not, we don't have a direction in Genesis that says one day God said, this is what I want you to do. So we find Cain and Abel bringing gifts to God apparently on a regular basis. Cain, the best from his flocks, Abel, the best from whatever he was growing. One day they brought their offerings And God was not pleased with what Cain brought. Now we're not sure how that was manifest. I've heard I've heard preachers really dramatize this by saying, they came and they built this big altar with fire on it, and they laid their fruit and they laid their animals, and one stack of smoke went straight up and one went sideways. But now that's, as we term, reading into the story, because there is no fire, there is no altar. It simply seems to be that they just came and presented it. Now I don't know if God was sort of like Star Trek, and when God saw the acceptable, it just kind of got sucked up. We're just not sure. But whatever it was, there was something in that process that Cain recognized that his sacrifice was not accepted. And then, of course, through that, we have the challenge of brothers. I never feel like that this was a premeditated murder because I had a younger brother. Uh, I really feel like it was a big brother fixing to tell a younger brother what not to do. Don't upstage me. And in the process of that discussion, things got out of hand. And we are way too familiar, especially in our generation, of what happens when somebody's anger gets out of control. And then it's too late. So it seems from all of this that part of what's going on is that relation with God is beginning to be formed by an acknowledgement of our work giving back to God. Of course, we know that Cain was cast out. Adam and Eve had another son, and things moved on. And then it's almost as if you can take a kaleidoscope and just twist it. That's the way things happen, especially in the book of Genesis. It just shifts and shifts and shifts. And suddenly we find ourselves here with Noah. Uh, Back up one sec. The other son named Seth was born. And when it talked about the third son, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son named Seth. And Seth, in turn, a son born by the name of Enosh. And then a statement. It was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name. So this is after that third son, is when humanity started reaching out and trying to connect with God, calling on that. Uh, and then, of course, humanity uh, finds itself in turmoil. They were doing their own thing, going their own way. God decides to uh, destroy the world with a flood. And in the process of all of that flood event, uh, at the end, Noah comes off, and it's time God actually instructs him. Noah came out together with his sons and his wives, every animal and uh, every animal, everything creeping, every bird, everything that stirred on earth came out of the ark by families. Then Noah built an altar. First time that word's really used, the concept of an altar. And then taking every clean animal and every clean bird, he offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a pleasing odor. Never again will I doom the earth because of man, since uh, the devisings of man's mind are evil, even from his youth. But now suddenly we find the instruction. Worship is going to include the concept of building an altar. And even here, we don't have a directive. It says that he came and offered these animals, but then part of that included a sacrifice, which is that killing of something, giving its life to provide an acknowledgement. Um, so the text identifies that sacrifice being used. Uh, it's often strange to hear the words that you've got burning flesh and hair and everything on an altar, and it says, and it's a pleasing smell to God. So it's not, if you've ever been around anything like this, you know it's not a pleasing smell at all. But throughout these first chapters, and even throughout a lot of the Bible, they tell us the high points, but they don't give us the particulars. And so we don't know a lot of things. What they were not concerned about so much the active process. What they are worried about is the outcome and what it teaches us. Over and over and over again, stories of the Bible are not meant to be held in this context of our postmodern mind dissecting it every word. But the end of the story always comes with a question. What does this teach me? That's the whole concept of this. And the whole book of Genesis is a book that step by step by step, at the end of every story, we stop and say, now, what did this story really teach us? Uh, the Adam and Eve story, what did it teach us? You're supposed to obey God. If not, you have penalties. The Cain and Abel, you have to keep your emotions in check. The Noah story, uh, when things get so out of hand, every now and then God breaks into the world and has to do things. So you run into all those types of things. Uh, and so much of what we're doing here is written down eons later. Some of you may have taken Disciple or you've done Genesis study. You know that the book of Genesis was not written down with Moses and Abraham, and the actual writing of the book of Genesis didn't take place until maybe about 900 BC. That's after Solomon. And the strange thing about some of this is that the book of Genesis has three different authors to it. There's a J, a Yahwist author. There's an E, which is Elohim, and then there's a P, which is called the priestly writer, which is the redactor of putting everybody together. This is why when you open up Genesis 1, you hear a very detailed step by step by step order of creation that starts with the world and the land and the grass and the birds. And then you start in Genesis 2, verse 4, and suddenly the world has started off, has already been formed. It's a dry, dusty ball. God makes man first, then God does the garden, then God does the animals, then God makes Eve. And it's because of two family stories. And these stories were blended together basically to keep peace in the family. The J stories, the Yahweh story, uh, if you'll look in your Bible, when you see in your Genesis, you'll see the word Lord, and it's all capital letters. That means there's something behind that word that they don't want you to say, and that is usually the name Yahweh, their name of God. They don't want you to say it and use that word wrong, so they put a name over the top. The other one is Elohim. It came from the stories of the Northern Kingdom. So the Northern and Southern Kingdom uh, had their issues with how they told the stories. And the redactors, like the priestly writer, said, listen, guys, we're sitting here at the table. I know you said your mother told you creation happened like this. And I know you said they told you this. You know, why fight about it? We'll just put them both in there. And they never worried about it. We worry about it and try to call the Bible completely false and fake and leads us astray because we can't figure out what's going on. And we understand how family stories go, and that's why I said it's not the particular; it's the end result of it all. Um, a lot of that comes to how we now perceive these worship things. There's these things called totems, and of course we're familiar with totem poles, especially up in Alaska with the indigenous people up there, our Native Americans did totems. The totem pole was created in such a way that it told a story. It told a history. It is something that people could come to and look at and say, oh, now I remember the story. That's what stained glass windows in churches are supposed to do. When stained glass windows in churches first came out, it was to have stories of Jesus portrayed so you could remember the story. So totems are things that we set up as a special place where we can remember things. That's why they built the pyramids, so that they would be remembered. That's why they set up Stonehenge, so they could tell the story about it. That's why they did the ziggurats down in Babylon. All these things being set apart. Uh, Totems in the Bible were not things of beauty; they were things of creation for a purpose. Uh, and they would always use what was at hand. Years and years ago, my dad had a very, very good friend who went to the Holy Land, spent a week or so over there. And after they got back, they were around the table on Wednesday night when they had their Wednesday evening suppers. And Dad said, well, Ralph, what did you really see when you went over there to the Holy Land? He said, well, David, I saw rocks and rocks and more rocks. And that's what happened. When you read some of these early stories, you hear something happened to an individual, an important event happened. And it said, and they would put up a pile of stones. Sometimes they would pour oil over it. And those stones would stay there as a remembrance and move on. So that during the times when a family would be walking through, a child would look over and see a pile of rocks and would say, Dad, who put these rocks here? The father could tell the story. Well, let me tell you about what happened in this place. And so these pillars of stone became totems, places that marked. And then some of those even became a little more elaborate. And that's the one we often call Ebenezer. Every time I see that word, my mind goes back to Charles Dickens, you know, A Christmas Carol, and how that played out. I actually met Ebenezer, or I seemed like I did, when I was taking some classes over at Oxford. I had a most marvelous professor over there, uh, John Fenton, who was probably in his 80s when he taught me the book of Matthew. And he came in one class. He was about probably 6'2" or 6'3" and probably weighed 130 pounds. Uh, Long gray hair that hung on his shoulders. He was an Anglican priest, so he had his collar on, deaf as a post. He just kind of leaned over to you and listened, and when he would answer, it'd just be unbelievable. I thought that's the closest thing to Ebenezer I could ever get. But there was a text about how this all came about. Um, Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shin, and he named the stone Ebenezer. For up to now, he said, the Lord has helped us. And that became a thing to do in different places. When you found yourself in a place where God really blessed you, you would put up a singular stone, and it was called an Ebenezer. And we even sing about that in one of our hymns. Uh, Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. So you have those types of things. The root word, Ebenezer, really stone place, a place where the stone is put to help us remember things. And we still do that uh, in our cemeteries. That's what we do. I think it's interesting sometimes we still call it tombstone. We don't really have a tomb, but we call it tombstone. That's like we still call musical recording a record, and they haven't made a record in who knows how long, or a film. But these things are helping us to remember. Uh, Nowadays, We even have audio in things embedded in gravestones. They take laser prints and put pictures of the individual so you know exactly what they look like. Uh, these are places where people can go and they can remember and hold on to. The next event that moves us forward and closer toward worship was that call of Abram and Abraham. Uh, Abram grew up in a community called Ur, down or in the Babylon area. Uh, they were a very progressive people. The Sumerian people that came out of this place were the ones who created mathematics. They were the first ones to create what we would call a city state, where people would work together in trades and things. They were very powerful linguistic people. They would tell stories, and they were big time on their worship. Although it's not exactly what we would call worship, but they called it that. Their primary god was the moon god, Nah. And so Abe uh, grew up in Ur under that influence of what we would term as pagan worship. At some point in time, and we're not really sure why, Abraham's father picks up the family and moves north to Haran. Uh, and that's where he grew up. And part of the reason he picked that town was because they were a sister city to Ur, and they also worshiped that moon god. And his dad, apparently, at least from traditional ancient stories, was a maker of idols. And so that's how he moved to that place. Uh, these people worshiped the moon god. They built altars. They made sacrifices, both of animals, especially bulls, uh, and apparently once in a while, out of necessity, a human. Um, but what happens out of this? There's an ancient story where it says that Abraham one day figured out that maybe the god Na was not in the idol. The idol was not a god. And he had debates with his father about this is not right. I don't know if you ever had a debate with your father before. Sometimes it doesn't end up the way you want it to end up. I had more of those than I wanted. But uh, it says that he went out, his father went out, and Abraham went in and cracked all the little statues and only had left the one big one. And in the hand of the big god, he stuck a hammer. And when his father came back, naturally he was more than mad and started really railing on Abel. Why did you destroy all this stuff? He said, No, Dad, I didn't do that. The big one did it, crushed all these little ones. And his dad said, He can't do that because it's just a statue. And then it was, Oh, is that so? So even at that point in time, there was apparently a question in the mind of Abraham, Abram, that there had to be something deeper. And so that's where he began to come in contact and receive that call from a God that was not named Nah, but one who was named Yahweh. And he would began listening to a call. I want you to pack up your family. I want you to go to a place where I will show you, and there you will worship me. Abraham's an old man. His wife's an old lady. They have a nephew that stayed with them, and apparently he was successful because he had a whole horde of people that stayed with him. But it said he left his native land and moved out westward to where he felt God was leading him And he built an altar, and God appeared to him. And that is where this whole now concept of saying, oh, now Yahweh and altar really go hand in hand. Uh, there is a story about sacrifice, where he has a vision. Animals aren't burned, they're just slaughtered, and he goes through it. Uh, and that's the first sense of animals being slaughtered in the presence of God. But that sacrificial incident went one page deeper. And that was a page when God told him to take his son, his only son, and sacrifice him. It's a very powerful story. God tells him to do this. He never questions God. He goes out, he packs up uh, animals with wood. He carries him a stick of fire. He brings the servants with him. They go days into the wilderness until God says, this is the place. And I always find it interesting. They take the fire, they take the wood, and he puts it on the back of Isaac. And then he says to those guys, stay here with the animals until we get back. Kind of makes you wonder. But of course, we know the story of how he goes up there. He builds an altar, he puts on the wood, he's ready to light the fire. He has the knife raised to actually slaughter his son. We never hear his son say a word. He trusted his dad with utmost confidence. And it's not until he's ready to put that knife into his own son that God intervenes. There was a question by the boy on the way up. Well, we got the fire, we got the wood. Where's the sacrifice? God will provide. And sure enough, that's what happened. The ram caught in the thicket. So you have that connection of the altar moving forward. And this is the first time that we ever hear the word uh, worship. It, After these things, God tested Abraham and said, here I am, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom I love, to the land of Moriah, and there you shall offer him on the mountain that I shall show you. And he goes up and he carries the fire, and the two of them walk together, and we're going up to worship. So this is the first experience, and now we're beginning to use a word for what happened. They invoke the name of God. They call upon God. They worship God. Isaac later is uh, told of building an altar in order to sacrifice and go to God. And then, of course, we move quickly to Jacob. Now, this I'm giving you a super fast forward lesson through Genesis. Uh, you know the twin brothers. You know about one tricking the father. Uh, he was also one that was called Mama's boy. He was a homegrown. He planted. His brother was a hunter. After he tricked and got the blessing, uh, he ran out of town because he feared his brother would kill him. He ran up to a place. He finally got in the wilderness. He's not used to sleeping outside all by himself like his brother. He goes up on top of a hill. He built himself a safe shelter. He has a dream, and in that dream, he sees angels of God going up and down a ladder. I got in deep trouble about that when I was in seminary. I was taking a course in Daniel through a lady whose name was Dr. Carol Newsom. She went to Birmingham Southern, grew up in Birmingham, and taught Old Testament at Emory. Uh, Her nickname was Gruesome Newsom, which gave you an idea. And in seminary, you could take one course for pass fail, and I took this pass fail but I wanted to have her. And she talked about angels and Daniel, and she wanted me to write a paper about angels and Daniel. And I made the statement that angels didn't have wings. And I said, if they had wings, they wouldn't have needed the ladder to go up and down with and Jacob. They could have just flew back and forth. Now, not to hurt your feelings, but angels really don't have wings. Seraphim and cherubims have wings. There's nowhere that says angels have wings. But she just kind of chided me a little bit. Yeah, it's like a graduating senior to pull up something like this. But he sees these angels, flying or not, going up and down this ladder, coming to this one particular place. And when he wakes up, he says to himself that this is the gate to heaven. And of course, God came to him in a vision, telling him that he needed to move on down the road, that God would take care of him until he came back to this place. And when he woke up, he built an altar and named that place. Um, it also comes along later when he comes back to a place similar to that, that he wrestles with the stranger at Bethel. Now, there is a concept that says that where Abraham took Isaac to sacrifice him, and where Jacob slept and saw the angels going up and down the ladder, and the place where Jacob wrestled the stranger all night when he came back was all the same place in a community which is later called Salem. And this knob at the top of Salem, which eventually becomes the center of Jerusalem, is where the Dome of the Rock is. It was the Holy of Holies in the temple. There's a long string. Now, just like a lot of other things, it really makes a good story. I can't guarantee that that's the way it happens, but they like to tell it that way and draw it all together. Uh, But one of the things that happened when he had come back to doing this, and of course, he was afraid of his brother. He needed to get prepared. Uh, it said, so Jacob said to his household and all who were with him, rid yourself of the alien gods in your midst, that is, throw them out, purify yourselves, change your clothes, and let us go up to Bethel, and I will build an altar there to God who answered me when I was in distress, and who has been with me wherever I go. And this is the first time we hear about people preparing themselves physically to come into the presence of God, moving out the false things, putting on your Sunday best, as we would say, getting dressed up, cleaned up, preparing to come into the presence of God. Uh, and so that's a new directive. We will hear later on about the cleansing process of what persons do before they come into the presence of God. Uh, and that's why, as time went on, that's the phrase that we would use, putting on your Sunday best. I grew up in a time where everybody wore a shirt and tie and coat, dress to church. You had special Sunday clothes to wear. Now you can come in just about anything you want to. There's been some tension over that. Uh, One article said that the person said, I just cannot understand how anybody would go to church and want to find themselves in the presence of God and not be in their best in the presence of God. And that was the concept then, our Sunday best, dressing up to be a part of that. So suddenly we find ourselves in this process of how we um, come to notice the need, the concept, the understanding of building special things, setting spaces apart for the act of worship, getting ourselves ready. We never hear of Joseph, which is the largest part of Genesis. We never hear of him building an altar. Uh, we know he was directed by God often. Moses himself, uh, it wasn't really until the theophany on Mount Oreb where God appeared in the bush that he really became under a true understanding of who he was. Moses knew he was an Egyptian. He was raised by an Egyptian family. He knew he was Jewish. Uh, I've had people say, well, how do they know that? It's very simple. When all the boys went out to swim in the river, he was different. And so, it right off the bat, oh, you're not really one of us. You belong to that other bunch over there. So you have these things that create this. So Moses knew he was different. And when the people were in Egypt, all they had were the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's what bound these people together. They didn't have a book. They didn't have a Bible. They didn't have a text. All they knew that they were the ones who were called out by this Yahweh God to follow him. And so it's not until Moses goes up and receives the constitution, I guess we would say, of how to create a nation. We like to hear you say, well, we have the Ten Commandments. That's just the very tip of the iceberg. If you want to do some exciting reading, grab the book of Leviticus and really go through that. See how many times you just say, really? But there, and if you remember, the people were so wayward that they needed something to worship. And they could not come up with the concept of worshiping something that was invisible. They had to have something tangible. So they built the golden calf. Moses' task was to take a loose knit group of people of 12 family histories and turn them into a nation. Uh, After 400 years of being in exile, now God speaks to these people. And the first thing he says, you shall not have any other God before me. That's the number one rule. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Leave it all behind. Remember the Sabbath day to call holy. And so these people come out. They were often called Hebrews. Uh, Sometimes you heard it Israelite. When the people were talking about each other, they called each other Israelite. When the other people talked about that bunch of people, they called them Hebrews. The word actually means the dusty ones. Oh, here comes the dusty one. But they pointed out that these people now were creating for themselves a very specific way to worship and interact with God by putting signposts along the way. The early patriarchs did not go to church. They did not have a temple. They did not have a sacred cave. Wherever they were, they stopped and they were in the presence of God and made those holy places just that, holy. And so worship is not relegated to space or time or position. In my years of pastoral ministry, I would always say, if you come to church and if somewhere during that service you do not find a personal connection with God, then why are you here? Sometimes it can be a prelude. Sometimes it can be a song. Every once in a while, it might even be a sermon or maybe in a moment of silence. But somewhere in this worship experience that we have, whatever that may be, it's not so much the hows and when, but the connection that we make with the divine. That's what makes worship worship. So that's the gist of it. Uh, and I had some questions for you. You can kind of address those uh, if you want to. We'll talk a little bit about those. When humanity was created, God did not expect man and woman to be subservient in the acts of bowing down. It appears God expected them to build an intimate relation. How was it manifested? And I guess probably what I should put at the end of that was, do you actually have an intimate relationship with God? And how do you manifest that within your own life? Which may be too personal to discuss, but just think about it. Where is it that I have that intimate connection with God? In the Cain and Abel story, the whole thing centered around an offering. How do you feel when you don't think what you've given as your best is being accepted in the right way? Ancient people created for themselves a holy place where they expected and experienced a special connection to God. Do you have a holy place? You know, we used to always hear the preachers talk about going into your prayer closet. You don't need a closet, but sometimes you have a special place where you can connect. Abraham heard the voice of God calling him. Have you actually heard the voice of God telling you to do something? And if so, how did you respond? And then finally, the statement worship was not relegated to a time, but was intended to be spontaneous. And how do we react to that? So, those are my questions. What about you all? Comments, questions, concerns?